Welcome. This is the new voice of Ukraine. I am the managing editor, Romy Kukratsky, and with me is my colleague, Anthony Bardaway.
Hello, everybody.
As usual, 2 weeks have gone by and a lot has changed in the world. So let's talk about it. As always, these Q&A sessions go off questions submitted by you, the audience. So if there's anything you would like to know about Ukraine, the political situation, the war situation, anything at all related to this part of the world, feel free to submit it to us, and we are going to answer them live right now.
These Q&A sessions are part of an ongoing series. We aim to have them twice a month. This time we are having it as an open questions about the year that we just left and the year that we're now going into. If you would like to take part in these questions and answer sessions, or if you would just like to support New Voice of Ukraine in various ways, you can go to patreon.com/NVUA, where you will get, again, these alerts for these questions and answers. We have infographics, we have newsletters, and as of right now, we are trying to expand our options for you, our supporters, so you can get more out of the experience of helping out Ukrainian independent media. So with that as our introduction, I would now like to begin our questions and answers here with our editor-in-chief of the English Language Service, Romy Kukratsky. So we shall now begin. So first question was one that is quite relevant today, especially. Has Ukraine fixed the electricity?
Well, yes and no. Last year in 2023, 2024, Russia made a very strong concerted effort to degrade Ukraine's power grids, which they were quite successful in. Electricity generating stations and substations, transformer stations all across the country have been effectively destroyed. In Kyiv Oblast, where I and Anthony live, all of the thermal power plants in Ukraine, they use thermal plants that simultaneously generate heat and electricity, and that heat and electricity are then pumped into neighborhoods and buildings and so on. And according to the regional power company here in Kyiv Oblast, every single bit of their thermal generation capacity has been destroyed by the Russian Federation. However, despite those difficulties, Ukrainian power companies have gotten incredibly good at doing emergency repairs, at restoring power as quickly as possible, and at balancing the power system. A lot of the targets that the Russians struck have not been explicitly generation facilities, but transformers and substations. That is, places where power goes from the power generation plant, whether that's coal or nuclear, what have you, to people's homes. And it's that part of the grid that has been most impacted, since there's a lot of them and it's difficult to protect that many targets. However, Ukrainian power companies have found ways around that. They found ways around limitations. Nowadays, when the power does go out, it's typically an emergency outage that lasts for a couple of hours. Though, again, this has been mostly a consequence of the most recent Russian strikes being just very ineffective for, a multitude of reasons. One of those being that Ukraine has gotten a lot more experience with air defense, and Ukrainian air defense units have gotten a lot better at blowing up drones. So the power situation can still be bad. It is still possible to be plopped into a 10-hour or more per day blackout. But under normal circumstances, everyone basically has power all the time, except for either complete emergencies or whether the power companies will announce that they are repairing or testing something and that there will be a scheduled outage, which obviously is a lot easier to deal with, especially when they're short term, than an emergency outage where you don't even know when the power could theoretically be turned back.
And of course, that is very variable depending on where you are. If you are closer to the front line, there'll be more outages. But here in Kyiv, I will say that for this winter, originally I was quite pessimistic. I was very worried that we would spend multiple hours a day without electricity, without heat, without anything. And that did not turn out to be the case for the reasons that Romeo has already explained regarding air defense, things like that, because there has been enough defenses to prevent it. And what we saw this winter, this morning, actually, I did have an outage, and there are a few other days where there were brief outages, but nothing so severe or over an extended period of time.
Yeah, hopefully that trend stays. Again, Ukraine has gotten a lot better at defending against especially the mass attacks. One of the reasons, especially in the first year or two of the full-scale invasion, why the power system was so impacted was because the Russians would use mass attacks. They would stockpile drones and missiles and then send them all over a couple of days, where you would have hundreds of drones and possibly even hundreds of missiles being fired. However, that tactic seems to not be as effective for the Russians anymore. They've tried quite a number of mass attacks or swarm attacks, and we can see in the interception data that style of attacks simply has gotten much less effective as time goes on. The interception stats go up and confirmed hits go down.
Okay, so on to our next question, which is one that I think I'm a bit more prepared to answer, so I'll ask and answer it. What is the overall situation at the front? Are the Russians likely to make gains in the near future? And to that, I have to say that unfortunately, yes, they are. We have, over the course of the last few months, seen the deterioration of the front line in especially the south of the Donetsk Oblast. They are now pushing up against the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and there isn't any clear places where that advance can be stalled. So I think that the main thing to watch right now is the South Donetsk front. That will eventually lead to what I see as what will be the big battle of Donetsk, which will be under the Sloviansk and the rest of that urban conglomeration, the northern part of that region. I simply don't see any of the problems that are occurring there being fixed anytime soon. However, that's Sloviansk area is far better fortified, and they're ready for a fight there. So I think that will not come quickly, but I think probably by mid-year, we'll be seeing a fight in the Sloviansk, Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk urban conglomeration.
I just want to add here, I recently spoke to a soldier on the front lines. His take was a little different. He believes the Russians will soon run out of their storm infantry, their assault infantry, these meat waves that you may have heard about. Suffice to say, that's not an exaggeration. They do quite literally tell people to run across an open field and get shelled by artillery, which you can then use to triangulate where that artillery is and conduct counter barrages. But according to at least this soldier, that he is expecting the Russians to basically run out of this capability or be incredibly limited in using these kinds of tactics in the very near future, along with much of the kit that they're using to expedite this, their armored vehicles, the BTRs and BMPs, again, according to him, are running low. However, they are kind of sending the best of what they have at the moment to Kursk. Kursk Oblast, or at least a portion of it, which is occupied by the Ukrainian military, is giving as good as it gets, in the words of the soldier. However, the pressure there is increasing. He does believe that in the near future, Russia will be pulling back its troops from offensive actions, especially in the Donbass front, in order to more effectively contain the Ukrainian incursion there in Kursk.
Yeah, this has been an ongoing pattern throughout this war, where the Russians will make a big advance, but in doing so burn through a lot of their manpower and material, which then leads to a pause in the fighting. This has been a continuous pattern. However, in this case, this is still basically the post-Avdiivka battle going on, where they have not slowed down since then, but I mean, the laws of physics here say that eventually they have to stop and refit eventually, and are pushing as hard as they can until they reach that breaking point. And this will be another issue that we'll be getting to later down on the list. I really think that a lot of this push was to take as much before the incoming U.S. President, Donald Trump. The elections first and now the inauguration, getting what they can to set the table for any kind of forced negotiations or anything else that may occur under the next U.S. presidency. That's why they have been going so full bore at great expense to themselves. But on the Kursk issue especially, is there any update on the North Korean soldiers? This has actually been a question that we've been receiving a lot from our supporters, and so sliding it in here. We did have a question and answer session where we talked more extensively about the North Koreans, I believe in November, when they were first introduced to the fighting. But what do we know about them now?
I mean, we've seen pretty consistently that the North Koreans are being actively used in defensive operations by the Russian military in Kursk. However, according to the Russian military bloggers, which granted are not the most credible of sources in the best of times. So take what I'm about to relay here with a grain of salt. But according to a lot of these military correspondents, these are not the most motivated of guys. They aren't the brightest of guys, though this might just be the language issue. They're not being used in especially clever ways. I mentioned those meat waves before. Right now, a good chunk of the North Korean soldiers are fulfilling that role. The Russian military and Russian military command has even less investment in their survival than they do of the typical Russian soldier, which is not high. As a result, the Ukrainian military is neutralizing quite a lot of them. We're beginning to capture some, I believe, actually. In the past 2 weeks, we saw the first POW, or at least the first publicly confirmed POW capture of the North Koreans. Reportedly, and again, a lot of this information that I'm saying is coming through unverified Telegram channels or hearsay or rumor. So it's hard to pinpoint, but I will say reportedly, the soldiers have been advised to commit suicide rather than be captured. Honestly, given the reputation of the North Korean regime, it's hard to say that that's bad advice. But yes, they are being actively used. They don't seem to be very well treated. And we are starting to take more and more of them prisoner. Though it is still a giant question whether the North Koreans will want them back. And honestly, ethically, whether Ukraine should repatriate North Korean POWs to such a despotic and murderous regime.
If this is their way out of North Korea, maybe they'll take it. We already had one interview with them that was published online where a North Korean soldier said that he would prefer to stay in Ukraine. So who knows? This next question is, I think, the one on everybody's minds. The one that we just, not only as a journalist, but also as a private person, that I get asked.
As humans who exist in the current...
Humans who exist in Ukraine or in relation to Ukraine. Is Ukraine ready to work with President Donald Trump? Do you think that will lead to more or less support?
So there's a couple of ways to go about this. And to get the first perspective out of the way, which is going to be my personal perspective, and full disclosure, I am an American citizen who did vote for the Democratic candidate in the previous presidential election. I am not a fan of Donald Trump, neither professionally nor personally. I have a very low opinion of the man as a whole. He is a convicted felon. He has been credibly accused of sexual assault. There are open questions about the legality of much of the ways he has earned his supposed fortune. Overall, I do not believe this is a man qualified to be president of the United States or to hold any kind of job. I would not hire him to run the counter at McDonald's. However, that said, there is also evidence that Donald Trump has direct connections to the Russian government. He has direct connections to the Kremlin. His first campaign manager in 2016 was the same man who ran Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych's campaign. There are direct documented financial ties between the Trump campaign and Russian affiliated entities and businesses. There is little doubt in my mind that Donald Trump, whether he's an agent or what, but that Donald Trump's interests align with Vladimir Putin's in many, many ways. As a result, I am incredibly pessimistic about U.S. actions past his inauguration and U.S. support for Ukraine or democracy in general. Donald Trump himself has proclaimed that he will attack his enemies and suppress unfavorable media. These are things that Trump and his cronies have admitted to doing, that have bragged about doing, that are fantasizing about doing. If you read the social networks where these people hang out with, like Truth Social, and the attitude of the electorate that Donald Trump purportedly represents is also not pro-Ukrainian. In very many cases, the ideology that leads people to support Donald Trump is the same ideology promulgated and promoted by Vladimir Putin, by Xi Jinping, by the Iranian mullahs. There is quite demonstrably, and I guess if I were to be a bit hyperbolic about it, I would call it an axis of authoritarianism, where a lot of these anti-democratic authoritarian forces are working together, collaborating in order to achieve some geopolitical results. And I do believe Donald Trump's election to president a second time is one of those things. And I see very, very little to be hopeful. Now, again, that was my personal opinion, flavored, of course, by my personal biases and prejudices and my own experiences. There is a different perspective, technically, that one could take if one were to ignore the character of Donald Trump himself and focus purely on American national interests, in which case, again, if you ignore everything Donald Trump has ever done, said, or indicated in any way, shape, or form, then there is a perspective where you can say, well, it is obviously in the United States' best interest to continue funding Ukraine, to continue degrading Russian capability, to continue isolating Russia diplomatically. And the American electorate has signaled that they want less foreign adventurism. That seems to be a common thing in polls, that the American people would like the U.S. to be less involved in foreign conflicts. And again, this is a perspective that ignores everything Donald Trump has ever said or done. However, in that perspective, if you look at the man chosen, if you look at it purely as this is the person chosen to represent this more isolation strain of American thought, however, that is not anti-American, then even then it is still beneficial for the United States to continue supporting Ukraine. One example that is brought up is that the Trump administration provided many of the Javelin anti-tank equipment to the Ukrainian military immediately prior to the Russian invasion. And that was a transfer of aid done under the first Trump administration. So people do point at that and say, well, he's clearly not completely a Russian stooge. He did help Ukraine, even he puts conditions on that aid. So I think the best case scenario you can say is that Trump is likely to continue aid, albeit with more caveats than the United States has previously placed, or rather, I should say more directly political caveats than the United States has previously placed on the use of its weapons by the Ukrainian military. However, I do not think that is an accurate or useful perspective to have, because again, it only functions if one ignores the entire corpus of Donald Trump's sayings, his statements, his lies, his speeches, everything that this man has done and said, especially in relation to Ukraine, has pretty much never been positive. And I see no reason why he would suddenly become one of our friends when he has spent so long being quite obviously an enemy who has publicly admitted to being an enemy of Ukraine. So it's hard for me to be confident. But again, there is the perspective saying, well, he is a strong man who wants to look strong, and helping Ukraine is obviously good for America, so he's going to do it. Maybe that'll be the case. Again, I am incredibly skeptical that is how things will shake out.
Okay, so that's definitely the pessimistic view, which I myself am inclined to, but I'll kind of steel man this a bit. For one, with any presidential administration, it's not just the president, it's the administration. And for some of these national security picks, they have come from the more pro-Ukraine side of the Republican Party. So a lot of the decision-making behind the scenes will be done by people who have shown more comfort with Ukraine in the past. It's not just the one person. A big exception to this, of course, is Tulsi Gabbard, who is directly connected to Vladimir Putin, to Bashar al-Assad, etc. She's a massive threat to Ukraine and the free world. But it seems as though her confirmation is the one that is most likely to fail at this point as a head of intelligence. I forget which one specifically.
Director of National Intelligence.
Director of National
kind of combined oversight body for all the three-letter agencies.
Yes, but a lot of the other NatSec picks have been more in our favor. Of course, the vice president, Vance, very hostile to Ukraine in the past and in the present. But we'll see who in, the palace intrigue wins out there. And we have also seen some cases where, for example, in Georgia, a question that we're going to later, the Georgian opposition, which is very Ukraine friendly, in line with Ukrainian interests, supports us very strongly against Russia, etc. They have somehow gotten some inroads into the incoming administration. The U.S. government has been passing a lot of restrictions on the pro-Russian Georgian government and supporting the pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian opposition there in the big protests. And I just saw that Zorabashvili, the outgoing and, in my view, still valid president of Georgia, she has, for example, gotten a seat at the Trump inauguration, which it doesn't look like the Georgian government has. So looking at those palace intrigues, there is some room to be optimistic. And the other is some of the particulars of Trump's methods can be used to Ukraine's advantage. We have seen this in Israel right now, actually, where the Trump administration did push for a ceasefire in Israel-Gaza, and that ceasefire looks like it might be happening. And if Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, goes against that ceasefire, it means that he'll be kind of running afoul of Trump. And that's not something that he'll want to do. And some of the declarations made about a ceasefire in Ukraine, which we'll get in more detail later, has involved Ukraine playing ball a lot more with Trump on that, more so than Russia. Ukraine has shown willingness to talk about some of Trump's proposals, and the Russians absolutely have not. And within Trump's MO, that is how you turn him in your favor. So I am still largely pessimistic, but with those other things in mind, all hope is not yet lost for U.S. support.
We'll find out in 3 or 4 days.
We'll find out. And overall, the U.S. has a certain amount of momentum to it, and the phrase turning the ship of state is quite difficult. So big changes are hard to do. Next question, though, which is more on what I just said regarding the peace talks. European and American politicians have been talking about calling for peace talks with Russia. Have any of the proposals been something that either the Ukrainian government or people would accept?
Short answer is no. The long answer is no, but with more detail. Basically, the Ukrainian people have indicated, and polls are very slowly changing. But so far, the majority of Ukrainian people, or at least according to surveys and polls that have been taken by independent polling agencies, most people are unwilling to trade Ukrainian territory for peace so far. Again, the polls are slightly shifting in the opposite direction, but so far, as of the start of 2025, most Ukrainians are still against the thought of trading any territory for peace. Unfortunately, most of the proposals, especially the proposals that have been offered by U.S. pundits and politicians, have basically involved exactly that: de facto normalizing of the territories that are occupied by Russia in Ukraine, and then a ceasefire and further talks from there. Again, this is currently unacceptable. However, it has been 3 years, going on 4 years, and people's patience and tolerance for the war has significantly lowered. People are tired. They are tired of seeing their loved ones drafted. They are tired of seeing their neighbors and their cities get bombed. They are tired of all the minor issues and grievances that pop up while living under martial law. They're just generally tired of constantly feeling at threat. That said, so we might see an intensification of this attitude as the war continues, because as of now, there does not seem to be any reasonable and or any victory decisive for one side or the other. Things are not exactly static, but more or less evenly balanced. They're pushing in Donbass. We're pushing in Kursk. They're launching drone attacks across the river in Kherson Oblast. We're doing the same. There's a lot of small positionings, but not a lot of big victories that would tip the conflict one way or the other.
Yeah, that is the thing, is that there is broad support for a peace treaty. When you have these polls, when you ask, would you as Ukrainian like to see a negotiated end to the war? The common answer is yes. But once you get to what would have to be given up, it's usually no. And if you're looking towards what Russia would ever accept in a peace deal, that is right out. Perhaps we can go into more detail at a different episode, because that's a very large topic. But what Russia wants, Ukraine and Ukrainians will not accept, and therefore there's no peace treaty. You can say everyone can sit down all you want, unless there would be some massive decline in what Russia sees as its minimum war goal. Then there's nothing you can do at a peace negotiation. The option always exists to walk away from the table, and there's no reason why anyone involved would accept even the minimum standards of what the other side wants.
And for Ukraine especially, there is a fundamental understanding that if there is no external enforcement mechanism on Russia as a result of any negotiations, that any deal that will be agreed upon is worthless. The Russians do not hold to their word. They have violated countless treaties and agreements and memorandums of friendship and all of that between Ukraine and Russia. They continuously violate even agreements come to during war times, like not bombing evacuation corridors, for example. From the Ukrainian perspective, you cannot trust the Russians' word without some mechanism that ensures they will be held accountable. And unless Ukraine sees that kind of mechanism, and that mechanism could only be provided by essentially a foreign partner that is imposing this consequence on Russia, Ukraine will never agree to any deal, no matter how beneficial it sounds, because again, you cannot trust Russians. They have violated every single agreement they have ever signed with Ukraine. Without the ability to make sure that any violation will be soundly and immediately punished, Ukraine will walk away.
Yeah, and that goes historically too. Like all throughout history, when Ukraine makes an agreement with Russia, Russia breaks it and nothing happens to them. And so they push harder and harder. In this case, if any kind of peace treaty, any kind of peacekeepers or freezing of front lines or anything, if that was accepted, the punishment for breaking that peace treaty would have to be NATO tanks headed for Voronezh. Like that's the only way that peace could ever be secure, is unfortunately with very high and well-armed walls between Ukraine and Russia.
And for the current administration, they watched the Russians violate Minsk. The Minsk Accords, which were intended to resolve the conflict or the initial stages of the invasion, the Ukrainian government watched as Russia gleefully violated every term, accused us of all the violations they were committing, did it openly. The OSCE, which was one of the monitoring bodies tasked with ensuring that the Minsk Accords were followed, noted dozens upon dozens upon dozens of Russian violations, which had no consequence. Nothing bad happened to Russia as a result of violating Minsk, even prior to the full-scale invasion. So this was peace deal. This was a peace deal that the Ukrainian government and the Russian government sat down and hashed out with the help of foreign partners, and it was worthless.
Which included the loss of territory by Ukraine.
Exactly. And it was, from the Ukrainian government's perspective, a con. It was a scam. They were scammed into signing a piece of paper, and they lost territory because of it. With a history like that, it's going to be very difficult to convince the Ukrainian state that this time the Russians will totally not violate the treaty.
Peace is complicated. It's not just a word you say and then it happens because that peacekeepers look good. It just doesn't.
And I'm sorry to say, peace is not when everyone puts their guns down and stops fighting. That stops immediate violence, but that does not signify peace. The conflicts between Russia and Ukraine that drove Russia to continuously ignore Ukrainian agency and to invade us are not resolved just because we are not shooting at each other at the moment. Those are fundamental issues and fundamental differences in worldview that will need to be addressed or compromised somehow by Russia, not by Ukraine, because Ukraine is not forcing any kind of idea onto Russia. They're not forcing a definition of something onto Russia. The Russians will have to give up some of this fundamental Ukrainophobia, basically, in order for any kind of lasting peace to occur.
Okay, moving on to our next one. Keeping in line with diplomacy, I'll just kind of skip around a bit. Other European countries like Moldova and Georgia are facing pressure from Russia. What threat does that cause?
It's difficult to say that this causes a threat per se for Ukraine directly. Moldova perhaps more than Georgia. So these are two different countries, first of all. And you cannot lump the risk that the pro-Russian governments or a pro-Russian government in either of those countries would be for Ukraine, because the fact is Georgia's had a pro-Russian government for quite a while now. And despite this, the Georgian and Ukrainian governments have more or less kept cordial relationships. Ukraine has not interfered or even overly commented on the ongoing protests, the ongoing anti-government, anti-Russia protests in Georgia. And the Georgians haven't entirely thrown in with the Russian world. and don't claim that Crimea is Russian or that the invasion is a civil war, right? They're not repeating the most base aspects of Russian propaganda as you would expect if they were.
They kind of are.
They are starting to now, but they haven't done this for most of the time that the Georgian Dream, which is the ruling Georgian party, run by the oligarch, Budzina Ivanishvili, who is a Russian oligarch. Despite that fact, Georgia has only now started to hint that they are taking a harder anti-Ukrainian stance. That hasn't been the case typically, despite the fact that their government has been pro-Russian this entire time. If the protests in Georgia are crushed and do not result in any kind of reforms or changes to the ruling authorities there, I still don't think this will have much of an impact on Ukraine. Diplomatic relations will get a little bit frostier, but that's basically it. Moldova, however, is a bit of a different question, though luckily they seem to have been protecting themselves against Russian interference so far. Because Moldova is right in the border, and more importantly, because Moldova contains Transnistria, which is a Russian satrapy, a Russian city-state, effectively, that just exists between Moldova and Ukraine. That is officially Moldovan territory. Transnistria, and people spoke about this at the start of the war, is staffed or kind of the reason it can exist at all is because there is a Russian military base and some amount of Russian soldiers there. Those soldiers, mind you, are very poorly equipped. They're basically never replenished. They don't have any supplies. They can't get supplies because, again, they're sandwiched between Moldova and Ukraine, neither of which allow Russian flights to Transnistria. And it doesn't have a sea connection or anything. So the Russians can't really resupply it. However, the risk is that if there is a pro-Russian government installed in Kishinev, then the Moldovans may allow Transnistria to get more Russian supplies, and that way the Russian forces in Transnistria would now have to be taken as kind of a threat. Currently, they're not. They could not invade if they wanted to. They simply do not have the equipment for it. They don't have the infrastructure. They really don't have anything. For 30 years, it's simply been Russians in a base running criminal extortion gangs to fund themselves. And that has been the modern history of Transnistria. So those guys, unless they get some serious kit somehow, they're not going anywhere. But again, in theory, a pro-Russian government in Moldova could assist in that. Though, in practice, I don't really think there's much of a chance that the Moldovans are going to be taken over by a pro-Russian force anytime soon. Though the pro-Russian factions in Moldova are being more and more open with their aggression against the elected Moldovan government.
Yes, Moldova seems to be holding things down pretty well, so I'm not so concerned there. From a Ukraine perspective, of course, from Moldova perspective, I'm sure that the big political games that Russia is playing with them is very much unwelcome. Georgia, I am much more pessimistic about the new illegitimate government than you are. They have certainly turned much harder pro-Russian stance. They are basically saying that any opposition to them, if they get too out of hand, then Russia can invade them and enforce certain demands on the opposition that they are not strong enough to do. I will say, luckily for Georgia, Russia does not seem to have available forces to conduct a full-scale invasion of another country. Well, we never know. Let's not play games. But yes, of course, the draining of Russia's abilities overseas is definitely. I mean, let's remember one of the reasons that the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria fell was because the Russians did not have reinforcements to send to Syria to back up Assad. I think that is a very strong sign that, for all of Russia's bluster,
they don't have anyone to invade anywhere else with. For better or for worse, we have tied up the Russian military.
Very true. Very true. But from a also kind of rhetorical stance, the Georgian government has been using Ukraine as basically a threat against their people, saying that there is a, quote, global war party that's operating out of Ukraine that is looking to destroy Georgia. This is not a friendly government. Their ability to help or hurt Ukraine is limited. They are on the other side of the Black Sea, but
I would say they could help us quite a lot if they didn't have a pro-Russian government.
They can help us quite a lot, but don't know what they can do to hurt us necessarily. But anything that Russia stands to gain, Ukraine stands to lose. This is something that Ukraine has recognized in countries throughout Africa, for example, that Ukraine doesn't have much direct influence in. Ukraine still realizes that if Russia has a free hand in Niger, it hurts Ukraine. If Russia has a free hand in Georgia, it can hurt Ukraine even more. So there is lots of moving parts there, lots of cogs and wheels that are going at the same time. And if the opposition movement in Georgia does not win, there will be what I don't know what these negative consequences will be, but there will be negative consequences. And of course, support them just because Georgia deserves democracy and all that as well. It's good for them too. But next question here that kind of expands on this idea of how Russia is doing, what its capabilities are. We hear a lot about how Russia is facing economic and recruiting problems, but have heard this throughout the whole war. For example, the sanctions would destroy the Russian economy and all that, which clearly did not happen. How realistic that Russia won't be able to fight anymore anytime soon?
I don't believe this is a question that you can get a reasonable answer for. Quite frankly, because Russian economics are a black box by design. We know some of the techniques that they've used to prop up their economy. And it's hard to say exactly what state their economy is really in. We've heard about entire factories being basically depopulated and shift to the front. We've heard of difficulties faced by their shadow tanker fleet as it tries to hawk their sanctioned fossil fuels abroad. We've heard about the lack of equipment that they're running into. But at the same time, like this question said, these have been factors that we've been hearing of since 2022, and the Russians have held on. So it's, as always, if I were to say, yes, it is realistic, honestly, that would be an optimistic viewpoint. The truth is we don't know enough about the true workings and the true state of the Russian economy to say how long they can physically keep up the fight. In terms of the motivations to keep up the fight, that question fully rests with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and no one else, because the Russian populace, as we've seen so far, is in favor of this war broadly. They may not be in favor of the sanctions and the knockoff effects, but they are broadly in favor of reconquering Ukraine as they see it. They consider the Russian populace writ large, considers Ukraine to be a fundamental part of the Russian state, and they are willing to destroy their country in order to achieve that. The question remains, how much of their country are they willing to destroy? So far, the answer seems to be quite a lot. But let's keep in mind that, especially in recent weeks, the Ukrainian military has conducted dozens of rather successful strikes on Russian fossil fuel processing and production facilities. And this must play a role. There are physically a limited number of these facilities. The Russians cannot wish oil and gas out of the ground and into pipelines. They have to dig it. They have to process it. They have to ship it. They have to transport it. Ukraine keeps hitting all of these aspects of their fossil fuel production system. This must play a role. How big of a role it will play, again, without an insider's look at the Russian economy, it's impossible to estimate. It is unlikely that they will be able to indefinitely keep up the scale of warfare that we have seen so far. But whether that indefinitely translates to 1 year or 3 years, again, it is impossible to tell you. And if someone does, without as many caveats as I've given in my response, they're lying.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that we always hear about the Russian economy will collapse, so it'll be bad. The thing is, these sanctions have not worked, like I said in the question. It has caused a lot of damage. It has led to Russia having to find alternative sources, alternative buyers, alternative sellers. But they've basically figured it out. There is a lot of American-made computer chips in Russian weapons, for example. They get there somehow. There's a lot of... After the war began, suddenly there was a whole lot more imports-exports going out of Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Armenia. These countries that are very obviously being used as a backdoor to sell things to Russia, to buy and sell to Russia, while evading the sanctions. Recently, there has been more work done on sanctioning Russian fossil fuels. Even India has officially, at least, kind of went after some of these Russian fuel exports. The issue of the shadow fleet, these illegal ships that are used to export Ukrainian fossil fuels, there's more work being done as of right now to kind of clamp down on them after they caused a massive oil spill in the Azov Sea, and the environmental effects are more well known and more worried about. But that all has to do with political will, and political will can be fickle. As we talked about with the Trump question, will the United States be more sanction friendly? Honestly, I do kind of see it, because Donald Trump is very much in favor of the American fossil fuel industry, and by clamping down on the competition from the Russian one, that's one thing he did in his first term, was he did support these sanctions against Russian fossil fuels and wanting to outcompete them. So I think that that's one thing that we can look forward to in the future, is that possibly Trump will, if nothing else, like the idea of American liquefied natural gas having a larger market. But overall, the Russian ruble has gotten more precarious recently. There has been more backlash against the head of the Russian National Bank, so who knows if political pressure on her will cause her to abandon some of the policies that she has put into place to keep the ruble afloat. But we just don't know. And every time that someone makes a guess about what will happen to the Russian economy, usually turn out to be wrong. And we're not going to beat their record there on that. As for recruitment,
and just to add, there is another funding source for the Russian government, and that is the European Union, which still imports liquefied natural gas, LNG, from Russia. In December of 2024, they imported more liquefied natural gas from Russia than they did in December 2023. The European Union has said that they are going to very soon transition away from Russian LNG, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of worth of gas purchases that directly go into the Russian state coffer. And that ban has not been put in place yet. And there are forces in Europe working very hard to ensure it doesn't get put in place. So the Russian government still has ways to make money. They have not been completely and utterly isolated from the international markets, as some of the Russia sanction proponents would like to have you think.
So yeah, that's kind of a lot of these questions and answers have been on the more pessimistic side. So we'll get to the more optimistic question on the list. What are the biggest opportunities for Ukraine in 2025? Where do you see Ukraine's strengths going into the year? Where do they have room to gain? because one thing that we have seen more and more of is that Ukraine has gotten very effective at these strikes into Russia. These missile strikes, these drone attacks into Russia itself have shown to be much more effective, especially in these last weeks. There has been a massive campaign, especially against Russian oil refineries. And the other thing that I am very optimistic about is Ukrainian domestic production of weaponry. The Ukrainian military industrial complex before the full-scale invasion was quite small. Only a very small percentage of the new equipment in Ukraine, not talking about old Soviet surplus and all that, but of the new equipment in Ukraine has been very, very much reliant on our foreign partners. This year, last year, throughout the course of 2024 especially, we have seen Ukrainian domestic production go, I think, like triple or something, like quite extensive as a share of the Ukrainian stockpile, especially in the form of drones. Ukrainian drone technology is making leaps and bounds to the point where Ukraine at times has an advantage in drones. You have seen multiple times throughout the course of the year at various points of the front where Ukrainian drone use had larger quantity and quality than Russian drone use. This is very situational. This changes. It's a big arms race, but Ukraine is definitely in that. So I think that, to me, is the number one good thing coming out of Ukraine in 2025, as far as this war is concerned, is domestic war production going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen even announced cruise missiles, domestically produced cruise missiles, long range ones, after years of Western partners telling Ukraine, no, you cannot use long range missiles for strikes into the Russian real. Now Ukraine has its own domestically produced variants. We've seen long range drone strikes covering thousands of kilometers somehow that have also been successful from the Ukrainian side. The military,
they got as far as Kazan.
Yeah, the military production aspect really is not to be underestimated, and not just for Ukraine, but in Ukraine's partners too. One of the positive diplomatic moves, or really military moves, I should say, that the European countries took in 2022 is a number of them did begin reopening, expanding military production, especially of the Soviet shell calibers for artillery. These, in some cases, these were entirely new factories built from the ground up. In other cases, these were existing factories that were either brought to higher production standards or expanded to be able to produce even more. And all of that stuff, that construction, that has taken time, and we are seeing the payoffs of that. We started seeing the payoff of that in the last quarter of 2024. And as we go into 2025 and the year progresses, even more of these factories will be coming online. And a lot of these European countries, and this is mostly Central European countries like Czechia, like Slovakia, Bulgaria even, they have begun to produce more and more weaponry, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as well. And that is an incredibly heartening sign. One of the biggest risks, I would say, globally in 2025 is the risk that the United States may withdraw from NATO. And again, this isn't hyperbole. This is an explicitly stated policy desire of people in Trump's orbit. Trump himself has criticized NATO. He claiming that European countries don't pay their fair share. They should pay the U.S. more for their protection, etc. He's threatened NATO member states. So there's a big question of how long can Europe rely on NATO as its shield, basically. And with the kind of uptick in military industrial production in Europe, it becomes less risky to pull back from NATO for the European Union and focus more on European defense. And of course, Ukraine also benefits from that. We benefit if our partners are better defended. We benefit if our partners have more equipment that they can send us. If they make technological breakthroughs or innovations, Ukraine is a direct recipient of a lot of that advancement. So I definitely agree with you, Anthony, that military production is absolutely one of the biggest positives that we have for Ukraine in 2025. Absolutely. And to add what I think is another big positive is actually Ukrainian diplomacy. Ukrainian diplomacy has been pretty effective over the past 3-4 years, given the constraints that Ukrainian diplomats have had to work with. And we've seen a number of them get replaced. We've seen a few kerfuffles here and there with partner countries. But overall, Ukrainian diplomats have been pretty effective in marshaling support for Ukraine. I think especially in 2025, that will continue. Ukraine will continue to marshal more support than it otherwise would have, thanks to the strength of our foreign policy, the strength of our foreign service, and of course, Zelensky's own public image.
And we'll close off here with a much more lighthearted question than most of these. Are there any good Ukrainian movies or other pop culture that will come out in 2025? I would say, well, on 2024, the biggest Ukrainian pop culture development was the game Stalker 2. That is one of the biggest games around, at least from a popularity perspective. It's a real cult classic. The original Stalker 2 just came out. And that is, as a lot of the team that made Stalker 2 are soldiers in the war, and some of them have even been killed in the war. It has kind of become a very large part of Ukraine's cultural output, cultural diplomacy. The soundtrack of the game has become very popular and used in various ways in social media videos and that kind of thing. So Stalker 2, 2024, wonderful. 2025, there's one movie that is kind of doing extremely well in the film festival circuit right now. It's called The Porcelain War. It won the 2024 Sundance Film Festival. It's about soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers, who also have make porcelain figurines. It's very kind of artistic. The soundtrack is by the band Dacha Bracha, which is self-described as ethno chaos. So they're doing a lot with this documentary. I've not seen it yet because it's not out yet, but I'm very much looking forward to its wider release. And very soon, February 8th, is going to be the start of Eurovision season, and Ukrainians do love their Eurovision. I don't know, Romeo, anything Ukraine related that you would want to promote or talk about?
I'm not a big pop culture guy, I'm afraid.
Okay, fair enough. I think this is one thing that I think Ukraine can stand to promote more is its pop culture product. So maybe in 2025, you'll hear more about these things from us. But that will close out our question and answer session. Thank you very much for your questions. Again, if you'd like to take part of these in the future, please go to patreon.com/NVUA and join our list of supporters, where, again, you'll be able to get other benefits, including infographics, newsletters, and more as we expand throughout the year. So thank you all very much for listening, and Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava.